Welcome, Game Chasers everywhere, to episode 31 of the Collecting Confidant with your host, GunstarHero. And I'm back this week with another edition of the Solar News Report, which stands for the State of Limited Print and Retail News. So essentially, if you are a new subscriber, the Solar Report is a bit of a different animal where instead of doing reviews, I typically concentrate more on previews of games typically that either haven't been released yet or that I've had a brief dalliance with but haven't actually completed, or that I'm just generally interested in and want to talk about in a multi-title show format. So this week, I'm going to be centering two titles around a theme of treasure games, which of course is my all-time favorite developer of classics like Gunstar Heroes, Mischief Makers, Sin and Punishment, and Guardian Heroes and Radiant Silvergun, which we'll be talking about today in various different capacities. We've got two titles up for today. The first one is going to be Code of Princess X for the Nintendo Switch, which originally came out July 31st, 2018, and is a port of the original 3DS Code of Princess, which came out back in 2012, with a few extra features and a few differences, which we'll get into throughout this video. So in terms of how this ties into treasure video games, Code of Princess X is actually considered to be a spiritual successor to Guardian Heroes on the Sega Saturn. Now, before I get into how that compares in the gameplay, I do want to mention that Code of Princess X for a while on the Switch was out of print and considered to be one of those holy grail titles that was rising in price drastically. Well, publisher Nicalis.com, where you can get the physical copy, is now doing a reprint, and I'll be getting into the standard version later. But if you missed out on this game the first time, you will get another crack at it as of now, and we'll get into those details shortly. Again, this game is a spiritual successor to Guardian Heroes, but let's talk about the gameplay itself, and then we'll get into some of the connections later on. So, Code of Princess X, at its heart, is a side-scrolling hack-and-slash beat-em-up, but with RPG elements. And I'm not talking about light RPG, I'm talking about full-on combination of RPG and beat-em-up that works in a multi-plane design, just like its spiritual predecessor, Guardian Heroes, where instead of moving fluidly up and down on the battlefield, you're jumping between three different planes and interacting with the enemies on that specific plane or across planes in certain scenarios. So very briefly in terms of story, you start out as Princess Solange of the Deluxia Kingdom, and what's happened is that this kingdom has for many years coexisted with the monsters that are surrounding it, but all of a sudden the monsters get very violent and decide to attack the kingdom. Now, what happens is that the Discharn army of the queen blames the royal family for these attacks, so they end up banishing Princess Solange, but before she leaves, her father, the king, entrusts her with a sacred deluxe caliber sword that she must protect at all costs. So again, from a story beat perspective, bringing it in line with the original Guardian Heroes upon which this game is based. So now, you set out on this quest, and you're going to be going over 30 different quests and unlocking multiple playable characters, over 50 to be exact, including 8 playable characters that you'll be using in the campaign, and over 50 characters that you can also use in the free play and multiplayer modes of this game. So a lot of depth, and each one of these characters is entirely unique, has their own movesets, own style, so there's tons of reasons to come back and keep playing this relatively short campaign that can be completed in a few hours, but like I said, you can replay it using different characters and different styles, so lots of reasons to come back. In terms of gameplay, from a hack and slash perspective, you're going to have your standard light and heavy attacks, but then also a couple of cool features. You're going to have a lock-on attack, which allows you to do double damage to whichever enemy you've locked onto, and you can also attack them across planes if you're locked onto them, but then you'll also have 3 bursts you can employ during each quest, a maximum of 3, where when you enable it, it'll not only daze all the enemies around you, but then also deal extra damage to any enemies that receive your wrath. So then when you combine the burst with the lock-on, you can do extraordinary damage and just really lay the smackdown. And I will say, like the original Guardian Heroes upon which it's based, this feels great to kick butt. You just feel every impact. It's over the top like any good Japanese fast action game and just really feels good to punish enemies. So you'll enjoy it from that standpoint. And then After every round, you'll be able to collect gold, experience points, and you can spend that gold on buying new gear, which will enhance all of your different 6 stat capabilities in different ways. So it gets very fluid over the game as you buy new gear, level up in different ways, and it keeps it fresh from round to round. So now that we've talked about the game a little bit, let's talk about the development itself. So I did watch an interview with the game's producer, Yasuo Nakajima, and one of the things he said was that this game is definitely nostalgic, but in a modern feeling way. And in terms of nostalgic, obviously, this is a spiritual successor to Guardian Heroes, and to really get the game authentic, he actually recruited treasure staff who worked on the original Guardian Heroes, which is just awesome. So in terms of the talent he recruited, he was able to get Masaki Ukyo, who was the programmer for Guardian Heroes. He also got Tetsuhiko Kikuchi, who was the director and character designer of Guardian Heroes. And in addition to that, he was also able to recruit some Capcom staff. And we're talking about some heavy hitters who contributed to the art design, including Kinu Nishimura, who worked on Street Fighter 2, the Darkstalkers series, and Capcom vs. SNK, and as well Bengus, who worked on the Street Fighter Alpha series and the Marvel vs. Capcom games. So you'll definitely see it in the gorgeous, albeit a little bit pixelated art style. And I will say that that was kind of a controversial element about the game, that some people called it out for being pixelated. I will say, after having played a bit of Guardian Heroes, that I'm okay with the slightly pixelated style, because it does, again, pay homage to the original Guardian Heroes, which use scaling effects, causing some pixelation. So I think that it's appropriate for this game, and I'm totally cool with it. Now, let's talk about how Code of Princess X stacks up to the original 3DS release, and also to Guardian Heroes, upon which this game is based. So in terms of the comparison to the 3DS game that came out in 2012, in terms of what it adds, there are some cool additions in terms of the fact that in the original 3DS game, you only had 4 playable characters in the campaign, whereas in the Switch version, you have now 8 playable characters. And whichever character you're using, all the other characters you're not using will be also leveling up in the background, which I found is very cool. And then, of course, like I said, you'll be able to unlock over 50 different characters, which can be used in the free play modes and in the multiplayer modes, which are local and online. You will have local modes up to 4 players where you can replay the campaign, and then also online modes where you can not only do co-op campaign, but also versus battles up to 4 player modes. I will say, though, that in terms of the online functionality, not a lot of people are playing this game, so I wasn't actually able to get in and test out a match. So if you are an owner of this game and looking to get into some online skirmishes, you'll probably have to coordinate outside the game with people who own the game to get online at the same time. But otherwise, it's kind of a minor caveat. The single player experience in the local co-op is still pretty fun and has a lot to offer. Also, in terms of how this stacks up to the 3DS, yes, it does add for a lot of depth in terms of how you can level up all the different armor, but I will say I'm kind of surprised at some of the things that it takes away from the 3DS release. Most notably, it takes away the original English voice acting that Atlas added to the 3DS version when they localized it. Also, some things that I found kind of odd, which I think they did to increase the difficulty. So they got rid of the actual stat leveling that you can do after each round, which was in the original Guardian Heroes. They got rid of that and instead tried to focus on getting different pieces of gear to level up your stats, which keeps it fluid, but I still would have liked to have that stat leveling up after every round so you could have a bit more customization. And then also, I think to increase the difficulty, they opted with a 3 bursts per round mechanic instead of the original 3DS mechanic where you would simply just keep building up your burst as you were using it. So for example, in the 3DS game, you'd hit your burst, your magic power would drain, and as you hit enemies, you'd keep building up your burst until it ultimately ran out, which would help you with some of the very tricky bosses. And I will say that is ultimately one of my biggest gripes with the game of Code of Princess, is that the difficulty does spike drastically about halfway through the game. The first half, you'll be kind of breezing through it, having a good time, and all of a sudden you're going to encounter some really cheap bosses. And I will say they're cheap. I mean, when you're getting them down to their low health, they'll start pulling stupid maneuvers, and unfortunately it'll get so tough that you'll be forced to kind of go back, get out of the game, revisit previous quests, and just level up through some grinding so that you can get a bit more powered up and then revisit those bosses and crush them. So that will add a little extra gameplay time, but overall it's still fairly manageable if you just learn the game systems. So that's how it stacks up against the original 3DS release. But then I also want to compare it to the original Saturn release of Guardian Heroes and see how it compares and contrasts. So I will say, in all transparency, that I'm not an expert on Guardian Heroes. Even though I'm a Treasure hardcore fan, I never owned a Saturn back in the day, so I never got to play Guardian Heroes. I did play it recently, like a few stages to get an idea in relation to this video. And I will say, in terms of how it stacks up, comparatively, both games use 3 different planes. And in terms of the beat 'em up mechanics, they both play very similarly. It's got the same type of speed, same type of impact. But I'm going to say, even though Guardian Heroes is shorter, it's tighter, the story is more intriguing, and some of the stuff that they took out of Guardian Heroes that they did not include of Code of Princess, I think really would have put Code of Princess over the top, and still makes me feel that Guardian Heroes is overall the superior game. Number one, Guardian Heroes had multiple branching story paths, multiple endings, and a karma meter depending on how you treated innocent civilians versus monsters. And also it had that upgradable skill point tree after every round. And I'm going to say that, yes, it's very expensive to get Guardian Heroes in a Saturn these days. So if you really need to fill that void and you can't get your hands on Guardian Heroes, I will say that playing Code of Princess is kind of like the next best thing. But as I kind of feel like I willed our next title we're going to be talking about into existence, Radiant Silvergun for the Switch, I'm going to just kind of say this out to the universe. Treasure, if you're happen to be listening to this, if you can find a publisher, please remaster Guardian Heroes and put out a physical copy, because I am dying to play the rest of it. It's so wonderful. But in the meantime, if you can't get your hands on Guardian Heroes, Code of Princess X will scratch that itch. And again, luckily, if you are a Switch collector, Nicalis.com now has a reprint of it. You can go to Nicalis.com for $39.99 US. You can get the Switch standard version, including some bonus goodies, which they're not clear on, but I'm thinking if it's anything like the original retail release, it'll probably be like a mini disc CD soundtrack, so I'm hoping that's what's in there. Regardless, it's available now for purchase via Nicalis.com, and while supplies last. And now on to the second game in this treasure-themed solar news report. Of course, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about Radiant Silvergun for the Nintendo Switch, which is finally getting a physical re-release in the West for the first time via limitedrungames.com until Sunday, November the 13th, 2022 at the standard deadline of 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll be getting into those editions shortly, but we'll talk about the game first and why you should be excited and why I'm super excited, because even though I know I'm not responsible for this, I kind of feel like I may have potentially willed this into his existence when I was talking about Ikaruga a few episodes ago, which was the spiritual successor to Radiant Silvergun. So, if you don't know, Radiant Silvergun was developed by Treasure, of course responsible for GunstarHero, my favorite game of all time, and this originally came out in the arcades in May of 1998 with a Japanese Sega Saturn release a couple months later, and now got re-released on the Switch via publisher Livewire on September the 13th, 2022. It's available digital now if you didn't play the Xbox 360 version back in 2011. Now's your chance to finally play this title. I will admit from the outset that, again, because I didn't have a Saturn back in the day, especially Japanese Saturn, I haven't really had a lot of time with Radiant Silvergun other than playing a couple of levels in the past and watching videos. So this is all new to me, but I am so excited for this because I'm a shmup fan, and this is considered, along with Ikaruga, its spiritual successor, to be one of the greatest shoot-'em-ups of all time. So I'm super stoked to be talking about this. In a nutshell, like Ikaruga, Radiant Silvergun is a vertical shoot-'em-up, but the difference is that instead of having black and white polarity levels, you have 6 different guns, which are available immediately from the outset based off of 3 main types. There's the Vulcan, there's the Spread, and the Homing, and then you can combine these into 6 different weapon types, which are all assigned to a different button, so you don't have to cycle through them. It's very simple to access all these different attacks based on the scenario you're in. And then in addition to that, you'll have a short-range melee radiant sword attack that can not only help you vanquish enemies, but then destroy pink bombs. And as you do that, there will be a charge meter that'll build up that when it's full, you can actually unleash a hyper sword attack that will give you temporary invincibility and also just unleash devastating attacks on whatever enemies or bosses you happen to be facing. Now, There is a very cool scoring and combo system in this game. So over the 6 stages and 23 bosses you'll be facing, you will have this scoring system. It's based on 3 different colors of enemies. So you have your red enemies, yellow, and blue. So essentially the way it works is that if you kill 3 enemies of the same color type, you'll get a bonus. And then if you kill an additional 3 enemies of that same color type, you'll get an enhanced bonus multiplier on top of that, which will reset if you go after enemies of a different color. In addition to that, there are no power-ups for your guns in this game. You'll get everything right off the bat, but you will be able to level up the guns as you play and keep those levels as you play through your entire experience. So that's very cool and a nice quality of life option from the outset. Very simply, in terms of story, you're in the very far future of like the 2500s AD, where what has happened, scientists have excavated this mysterious stone-like object that has now caused the destruction of the Earth and wiped out all of the human race except for 4 lone survivors and their robonoid companion that are aboard the Tetra spaceship that is above the atmosphere. And as they're running out of supplies, they're forced to re-enter the atmosphere and fight for the human race's survival. And the story will be told not only through in-game dialogue cutscenes, which again makes it different from Ikaruga, which had more of just a general Buddhist philosophy permeating its story. This will be told through in-game dialogue cutscenes, but also anime cutscenes, which were not in the arcade version, but were added to the Saturn, just to give more depth in terms of the story and the lore. And the anime cutscenes were done by Gonzo, who had originally done work for Treasure on Silhouette Mirage. So I found these pretty entertaining, kind of fun, tongue-in-cheek, and the game doesn't take itself overly too seriously. That said, let's talk a little bit about its development and how it came to be. So we're going back to 1997. Treasure had worked extensively with Sega on many different titles, and at this point, Sega really wanted Treasure to do an arcade experience for them. So Treasure went to the drawing board, and one of their staff, Hiroshi Yushi, came up with the idea for a 2D shooter because at that time, the 2D shooter genre, he felt, had been totally played out. It had become completely stale. But the thing is, it was also considered a risky venture by the Treasure staff because we're talking 1997. So at this point, the fighting game craze had taken hold, and also 3D games were starting to come into vogue. So the idea of releasing a 2D shooter to the masses was considered a very risky undertaking. But Hiroshi Yuchi felt he had a really great idea, was very passionate about it, and decided, along with Treasure's president, Masato Maegawa, to go ahead with the project. So they brought in a 10-person team, and in terms of the inspiration for the game, they wanted it to be the antithesis to the Toplin style shooters like Tiger Heli and Truxton that had kind of dominated the arcade space. They wanted to be like the antithesis to those games, very classic shoot and dodge gameplay. And actually, the main inspiration for this game was 1988's Image Fight by IRM. So that was where the game was based on. So in terms of trying to breathe some new life into the 2D shmup genre, they decided to go with a classic approach, but also bring in some quality of life improvements. So for example, they decided to get rid of power-ups because they found that that would ultimately kind of lead to cheap deaths as you're chasing these capsules around. Rather, they decided to have all the guns available from the outset and just level them up as the game progressed. So the 10-person team set out to work on the game, and then during testing, Treasure's president Masato Maegawa found the game to be so brutally difficult that he couldn't even finish it. So he decided to enlist some actual professional shmup players to come in, test and debug the games to make it more palatable to a wider audience. And Maegawa would even go after the game was finished to arcades to see how players were reacting to it. Because like I said, the arcade was a tester to see how they would handle the Saturn port. And overall, thankfully, players actually did respond very well to the game, and it actually ended up becoming somewhat of a success. So that led it into a very successful Saturn release, and so on and so forth. So that was the development of Radiant Silvergun. It was released to great acclaim, quickly became a cult classic, and is now considered one of the greatest shoot 'em ups of all time, but unfortunately was stranded in Japan for a number of years. Finally, in 2011, it got an Xbox 360 release, digitally only, and it added some really cool improvements, including local and online co-op, downloadable replays, and some additional options, including an Ikaruga-style scoring system, as well as an optional upgraded graphics mode. So if you're used to playing the old 360 version, that is the port that was done on the Switch. So you'll be right at home if you do play the Switch version, which again is now available for physical pre-order via limitedrungames.com until Sunday, November the 13th, 2022 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. There's going to be 3 editions. The first of all being the standard edition for $39.99 US. Again, it's Switch only. Then there will be a $64.99 Steelbook version with a Steelbook slipcase. And then finally, the hefty $124.99 Collector's Edition, which I'm considering because I'm a treasure nut. It's going to include a big box, a bunch of goodies, and then the CD soundtrack, which is going to include not only chiptune arrangements, but the original soundtrack, which was done by famed composer Hitoshi Sakamoto, who was responsible for Final Fantasy Tactics and Final Fantasy XII. So if you're put off by having to buy an ultra expensive copy of Radiant Silvergun and a Japanese Saturn, if you have a Switch and you're a Radiant Silvergun fan, you are now at home. I, of course, will be getting my copy. Thank you for watching the 31st episode of The Collecting Confidant, another episode of the Solar Report. Make sure you like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one. Later, Game Chasers, and peace.